For 32 days, the pink plastic sentinel stood watch, an absurd, tropical rebellion against the monochrome conformity of the neighborhood. It was just a flamingo, a $12 impulse buy from a roadside novelty shop. But to the HOA, it was an act of war. They didn't send a warning or a polite request. They sent a certified letter, the certified threat, thick official envelope that contained not a fine, but a threat to seize the house. Everything they had worked for, the quiet life, the garden, the mortgage, all suddenly balanced on the thin plastic legs of a single lawn ornament. It sounded unbelievable, insane even, but how far would you go when a neighborhood association tried to foreclose on your family home? Over a bird? The street was called Whispering Willow Lane, a name that promised tranquility and delivered on it, at least for a while. This was Pelican Pointe, a meticulously planned community where the lawns were uniformly green. The house colors were strictly approved, and the most dramatic thing to happen on a Tuesday was the synchronized arrival of the garbage trucks. It was the kind of place people moved to for predictability. This predictability was the entire appeal for Elias. He was a man who valued order after years of chaotic city living. He and Sarah had the perfect cage found their corner lot house 3 years prior, drawn by the quiet cul-de-sac and the small patch of lawn where they envisioned sipping coffee and watching the local birds. They weren't flashy people. They simply wanted a beautiful, peaceful place to be. Their home was their sanctuary, and Elias had spent countless weekends making it perfect. Fresh mulch, perfectly edged flower beds, and a front porch where the setting sun fell just right. Pelican Pointe was governed by the Homeowners Association, the HOA, an invisible bureaucracy that ensured that the community's aesthetic standards never wavered. For years, the HOA was nothing more than a quarterly newsletter and a minor fee, an acceptable cost for the privilege of living in such a tidy bubble. The friction didn't come from the official rulebook, however. It came from the enforcer. Mrs. Thorne, the HOA President, lived 3 blocks away, but her vigilance spanned every single square foot of Pelican Pointe. She was the self-appointed guardian of the community covenant, a woman whose entire identity seemed wrapped up in ensuring that no one dared deviate from the approved beige, green, and navy color palette. The iron clipboard. She ruled with an iron clipboard, and her definition of maintaining community standards often felt less like governance and more like control. The quiet, almost dull perfection of Whispering Willow Lane was the foundation that made the coming storm so jarring. Elias and Sarah believed their home was theirs, a private haven. Mrs. Thorne, and by extension the entire apparatus of the HOA, believed the entire community was theirs to regulate. The first spark of conflict wasn't a major renovation or a loud party. It was something small, something utterly disposable. Something plastic and bright pink that Elias placed on his lawn one sunny afternoon, utterly unaware that he had just signed the opening salvo in a conflict that would threaten to destroy their peace and take their home. The first letter arrived exactly 48 hours after Elias placed the Flamingo. It wasn't signed by Mrs. Thorne, but Elias knew her handwriting in the margin. Sharp, aggressive slants of red ink. The letter, printed on thick embossed HOA stationery, didn't mention the Flamingo by name. Instead, it cited a deeply buried clause in the Community Aesthetics Covenant, a forgotten line about non-conforming yard art that violates the established residential visual harmony. Elias read the document twice, then laughed. It was absurd. His garden gnome collection had survived 3 years without a word. But the tone of the letter was far from a joke. It demanded the immediate removal of the offending article, giving a deadline of 7 days. Failure to comply, the fine print warned, would result in an automatic, non-appealable $1,000 fine. He immediately took the plastic bird and placed it not in the garage, but discreetly behind a rose bush, out of view from the street. Problem solved, he thought. The rule was petty, but the fine was steep enough to motivate compliance. 3 days later, the second letter arrived. It wasn't the usual white envelope. This one was a stiff manila folder marked Formal Violation, Repeat Offense. The fine wasn't $1,000. It was $5,000. The violation code was the same, but the language was amplified. accusing him of willful disregard for the governing authority. Elias was stunned. He hadn't put the Flamingo back. He paced the house, searching every corner of his lawn, confused. Then he saw it. The concealed crime. A tiny sliver of pink peeking over the top of the rose bush, visible only from a specific angle on the street. It was an oversight, a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. This wasn't a warning. It was a targeted attack. He marched down to the Pelican Pointe Community Center, fine in hand, demanding an explanation. The assistant, a nervous young man named Gary, wouldn't look him in the eye. Gary only pointed to a clause about concealed. Art, a rule that stated any attempt to hide or obscure a non-conforming item after a violation notice still counted as non-compliance until the item was entirely removed from the property. "The fine is for attempting to deceive the association, Mr. Elias," Gary mumbled, barely audible. "It's doubled." Elias realized that someone, Mrs. Thorne, had been watching, driving by slowly, possibly taking photographs, waiting for him to make the slightest mistake. This wasn't about the Flamingo. It was about control and proving a point. Elias paid the $5,000 fine under protest, a crushing blow to their savings, but he wanted the nightmare to end. He locked the Flamingo away in the attic, deep inside a trunk. He felt physically sick, not just from the money lost, but from the chilling realization that he was being surveilled in his own sanctuary. For 3 weeks, there was silence. Elias began to breathe again, believing the costly lesson had satisfied Mrs. Thorne's appetite for dominance. But the silence was just the reloading of the weapon. The next violation didn't concern the Flamingo. It concerned the magnolia tree on the corner of his lot. The next letter cited excessive canopy spread that encroaches on the municipal sidewalk, citing a different, equally obscure clause about trimming requirements. Elias looked at the tree. It was perfectly healthy, providing shade to the sidewalk. He trimmed it immediately, taking off every branch that dared to extend beyond the curb. The following week, another letter arrived. This time, the violation was for aesthetics of the mailbox post, claiming the paint was 3 shades too dark from the approved gray palette. He repainted the post. Then, it was the gutter downspout. Then, a few misplaced stepping stones in the backyard patio, visible only from his neighbor's second-floor window. Each violation came with a fine escalating from $500 to $1,500. They weren't about non-compliance. They were about creating endless compliance. Elias was drowning in a sea of petty, relentless demands. His weekend joy of tending to his home became a frantic, stressful race to fix imaginary problems before the next fine arrived. He was falling behind. The fines were being levied faster than he could address the violations. The original Flamingo incident had opened a door, and Mrs. Thorne was now walking through every room of his life, examining every detail with a hostile magnifying glass. The total fines crept towards $15,000. Drowning in demands. He was losing sleep, constantly checking the mailbox, his hands shaking every time the postman arrived. The ultimatum, the true shock, arrived on a Tuesday, encased in a legal document from the HOA's high-powered firm. It was not a fine notice. It was a statement of delinquency and intent to lien. The document aggregated all the unpaid fines, late fees, and administrative costs into a single debt exceeding $22,000. And the final paragraph stated, with chilling clarity, that under the covenant of Pelican Pointe, the HOA had the right to file a lien against the property and, if the debt remained unsettled, to initiate foreclosure proceedings to recover the money. Elias's blood went cold. This was no longer about a bird or a tree or a mailbox. This was about ownership. This entire, beautiful, peaceful community was suddenly threatening to eat them alive. They were using the fines as a weapon, accumulating the debt until it was large enough to trigger the nuclear option, taking the house. The absurdity had curdled into a terrifying reality. He drove to the home of Mrs. Thorne, heart pounding, determined to plead his case, to show her the paid fines, the receipt for the new mailbox paint, to beg for clemency. He stood on her immaculate porch and rang the bell. Mrs. Thorne opened the door, immaculate and utterly emotionless. Elias started talking, rambling about the Flamingo, the $22,000 debt, the unfairness. She didn't let him finish the sentence. "Mr. Elias," she stated, her voice a flat, dead monotone, "you chose to live here. You signed the agreement. We are simply enforcing the covenant you willfully disregarded. We have a community to protect." She paused, her eyes locking onto his with cold triumph. "The time for talking is over. The foreclosure clock is ticking." Elias stood there, utterly defeated, the smooth wood of her door mocking his desperation. He had fought the skirmishes, but he was facing a full-blown war, and the enemy was holding the deed to his home. He knew then that the only way to save his house was not to comply, but to find the one rule, the one loophole, the one weapon that could strike back at the president and the entire, ridiculous power structure she commanded. He drove home not with fear, but with a cold, hard resolution. He was going to fight fire with the very fine print they used to burn him. What rule did Mrs. Thorne herself break? He was about to find out, and the discovery would lead to a confrontation far more public and dramatic than he could ever have imagined. Elias had been locked away in his home office for days, the stack of Mrs. Thorne's violation notices serving as a constant, infuriating reminder of the ticking foreclosure clock. He wasn't looking at the rules she used to attack him. He was looking at the rules she had to follow. He had paid a legal firm a consultation fee, the last of his emergency fund, and they had given him one single, devastating piece of advice. The governing documents are a two-edged sword. The HOA's annual general meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning in the community clubhouse, designed to be a dull, 30-minute session where the old board was rubber-stamped back into power. It was meant to be Mrs. Thorne's uncontested victory lap, but Elias saw it as his only courtroom, his last chance to expose the petty tyranny before the formal legal papers were filed. The room was packed, a rarity, as the foreclosure threat on Elias's house had quietly become the single, tense topic of neighborhood gossip. When Elias walked in, the murmurs stopped. Mrs. Thorne, seated regally at the head table with her two silent board members, looked down her nose at him, a tiny, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She had already budgeted the $22,000 debt recovery into the community funds. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries. Mrs. Thorne controlled the mic, delivering platitudes about financial stability and maintaining our collective investment. When she opened the floor for new business, she glanced pointedly at Elias. "Mr. Elias," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I assume you are here regarding your unfortunate financial situation. I must remind the community that this association will not tolerate delinquency and will protect the covenant at all costs." The statement was a public declaration of war. Neighbors shifted nervously. This was the moment. Elias walked to the central microphone stand, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the coiled tension of weeks of injustice. He looked directly at Mrs. Thorne, bypassing the nervous crowd. "I am here regarding the covenant, Mrs. Thorne," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of sheer, cold determination. "And I am here to discuss your willful disregard of it." A gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Thorne's face froze, the control momentarily slipping. Elias didn't mince words. He pulled out two items, a photograph and a section of the HOA governing document, specifically Article 4, Section 3B, Commercial Use of Residential Property. This clause, Elias stated, holding up the document, prohibits the operation of a commercial business on residential property, explicitly including the storage of inventory, equipment, or products for sale, without prior written approval from the board. He paused, letting the silence build. Then, he slammed the photograph down onto the table. It was a high-resolution, time-stamped picture of ceramic bird feeders stacked floor-to-ceiling in a cluttered garage, directly on top of a section of the HOA governing document marked Article 4, Section 3B, Commercial Use of Residential Property. For the past 4 years, Mrs. Thorne has been operating a highly profitable online business, Thorne's Tidy Treats, selling specialty bird feeders. The inventory, packaging, and shipping are all conducted from her garage and home office. This is a clear, continuous, and unapproved violation of the Commercial Use Clause. The room erupted. Whispers turned to outright angry chatter. The woman who fined Elias for a misplaced downspout was running a factory out of her garage. Mrs. Thorne, sputtering, reached for the microphone. "This is slander. This is a desperate attempt to avoid paying your debts. My bird feeders are a small hobby, not a business." Elias anticipated the denial. He pulled out the second piece of paper, a printout from the state's Public Registry of Corporations, showing Mrs. Thorne as the sole proprietor of a registered LLC, along with shipping manifests and sales figures he had obtained through a legal public records request. According to her LLC filings, her hobby generated over $150,000 in sales last year alone. "But that's not the violation I want to focus on," Elias said, leaning into the microphone, his voice now ringing with absolute authority. "The covenant states that any unapproved commercial activity will be subject to a 100 per day fine until cessation. Mrs. Thorne has been operating this business for approximately 1,360 days. That is a total liability of $146,000 in fines owed to the Pelican Pointe Homeowners Association." The shock in the room was palpable. $146,000. It dwarfed the $22,000 debt Elias owed. Elias looked straight into the eyes of the board members who were shrinking under the weight of the collective neighborhood glare. "I am submitting a formal motion to the board," Elias declared, "that the $146,000 debt Mrs. Thorne owes the association be applied as a full credit to the debts of all members who have been unfairly fined or harassed during her tenure, starting with a full and immediate dismissal of the fraudulent lien against my house." Mrs. Thorne, sputtering, reached for the microphone. "You have no right. This is an illegal meeting. I call this meeting adjourned." But the board members, recognizing a legal catastrophe and a public relations disaster, had already dropped their heads in silent defeat. The two board members looked at each other, then at the furious community. They knew the fine print, and Elias was right. One of the board members, a nervous woman named Susan, finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Thorne, we have to table the adjournment. The motion stands, and the evidence is public record." Mrs. Thorne stared at Elias, her eyes burning with a hatred that transcended neighborhood politics. She didn't say a word. She simply grabbed her purse, pushed past the crowd, and stormed out of the clubhouse. She had weaponized the petty rules to seize his home over a Flamingo, and Elias had used the exact same fine print to bankrupt her position and destroy her power in a single, devastating moment. The quiet man of Whispering Willow Lane had won the war, not with money or muscle, but with the truth hidden in the fine print. The sound of the clubhouse door slamming shut, punctuated by the furious retreating footsteps of Mrs. Thorne, was not merely the end of a meeting. It was the sound of a spell breaking. The atmosphere in the room immediately shifted from suffocating tension to a giddy, almost hysterical relief. Elias stood at the microphone, the photograph of ceramic bird feeders still resting on the table, feeling the exhaustion of weeks of terror finally rush out of him. He hadn't sought applause or glory, yet the quiet, grateful nods from his neighbors felt more validating than any standing ovation. He was no longer the violator. He was the unexpected defender of the community's sanity. The board, stunned into paralysis, moved with the speed born of panic. They had witnessed the wholesale collapse of their leader's authority and were terrified of the legal liability Elias had exposed. Within 48 hours, the thick, heavy legal document threatening foreclosure was replaced by another, thinner document, a certificate of lien dissolution. The $22,000 debt, the fines, the late fees, all were summarily wiped clean, deemed a fraudulent assessment stemming from an abuse of power. The victory wasn't in saving the money, it was in the profound, immediate return of their peace. Elias didn't feel triumph so much as an overwhelming physical quiet. The relentless scrutiny was gone. The dread that had tightened his chest every time the mail truck slowed down evaporated. He and Sarah walked the yard, touching the magnolia tree, running a hand over the freshly painted mailbox, realizing that for the first time in months they didn't have to look over their shoulder. Their home was theirs again, its ownership no longer subject to the arbitrary whims of a tyrannical neighbor. The consequences for Mrs. Thorne were swift and severe, a dramatic enactment of the law of unintended consequences. She had wielded the rule book like a blunt instrument, and the fine print had swung back and delivered a crippling blow. The board immediately accepted her furious, shouted resignation. The $146,000 liability, accrued over 4 years of commercial activity, was an issue the HOA could not simply ignore. While the association didn't successfully collect the full amount, her lawyers fought relentlessly. The financial and legal pressure was relentless. More devastating than the legal bills, however, was the social exile. Mrs. Thorne had cultivated fear, not respect, and when her power vanished, the neighbors she had terrorized found their voices. The community newsletter, once her platform for passive-aggressive rule announcements, now featured articles discussing governance reform and the need for transparency. Every meticulously trimmed hedge, every freshly painted curb in Pelican Pointe became a silent monument to the absurdity she had enforced. She became a pariah, the very sight of her driving down Whispering Willow Lane enough to send residents retreating inside their homes, not out of fear, but out of disgust. Within 9 months, the house, the physical symbol of her meticulously ordered control, was put on the market. She was gone, leaving Pelican Pointe not in a blaze of glory but in a quiet, humiliating retreat, forced to relinquish the community she had sought to own. Her departure was a final, undeniable confirmation to everyone that the system, though deeply flawed, could still reject the cancer of unchecked, petty power. The community's gratitude, however, carried an unexpected weight. Elias, the man who only ever wanted peace, found himself the reluctant center of the new movement. The community, desperate for a leader who understood both fairness and the fine print, insisted he fill Mrs. Thorne's vacant board seat. He was initially hesitant. He wanted nothing more to do with rules and regulations. But Sarah reminded him that they couldn't just beat the monster. They had to dismantle the machine that created it. His term on the board became a process of surgical deconstruction. He didn't implement new, sweeping laws. He strategically deleted the old, insidious ones. Clause by clause, they removed the vague language that allowed for arbitrary interpretation, the visual harmony, the concealed art, the 3 shades too dark. It was dull, painstaking work, far less cinematic than the clubhouse confrontation. But it was the real, lasting victory. They rewrote the rules to protect the community, not control it, ensuring that future disputes would be settled with dialogue and logic, not punitive financial warfare. Pelican Pointe became quieter, not through enforced silence, but through genuine, communal understanding. Elias never forgot the single ridiculous object that had almost cost him his home. The original pink lawn flamingo, slightly faded and dusty, remained stored in the attic for a year, a strange relic of the war. When the covenant rewrite was complete, the board held a small symbolic ceremony. Elias took the flamingo, cleaned off the dust, and didn't place it on his lawn. Instead, he presented it to the community center. They didn't display it proudly. That would have been defiance. They encased it in a simple custom-built wooden shadow box which was mounted near the entrance, beside the framed, newly ratified, much shorter and simpler set of governing principles. Engraved beneath the pink plastic bird was a single, anonymous line, "The cost of compliance." The flamingo ceased to be a violation and became a talisman, a constant, silent reminder to every resident and every future board member that the spirit of the rule must always outweigh the letter of the law. The battle had taken far more than $22,000. It had stolen months of peace, strained a marriage, and tested Elias's fundamental faith in the idea of home ownership. Yet the outcome demonstrated a powerful truth. The pettiness of tyranny can only thrive in silence. Once exposed to the light of community attention and challenged with the tyrant's own weapons, the absurdity collapses. The story of the man whose house was almost foreclosed over a $12 lawn ornament became the new legend of Pelican Pointe, a constant, Vivid testament to the fact that when you buy into a community, you are not just signing a mortgage. You are agreeing to a contract for life. And sometimes, the only way to save your home is to read the fine print and turn the page on tyranny. But the question remains. If a single, silly flamingo could unleash a storm that violent, what small, overlooked detail in your own life could be leveraged against you by someone desperate for control? Is your peace really guaranteed, or are you just waiting for the next certified letter to arrive?